Welcome to this week's discussion on Parshat Ki Tisa. The chavruta this week is a woman who I believe really needs no introduction for anybody who's done anything Jewish in the last couple decades, a prolific writer and just thought leader about many topics, including leadership and identity and just the Jewish people. Dr. Erica Brown, thank you for lending your voice and your wisdom to this week's chavruta.
Thank you, Adam. There's nothing I like better than having a good chavruta, so let's go.
So Ki Tisa, this is a huge one. If even
Huge.
for people who don't know anything about our story or the text, Ki Tisa, the golden calf, the events of this parsha, this is one that people know about.
Yeah, they know about it. It's sort of a Cecil B. DeMille knowing about it, right? The sort of wild dancing around a golden calf, and then Moses coming down and being angry. There's also Rembrandt's Moses, right? There's this sort of blazing anger of people who've betrayed you. And then there's just Rembrandt has this painting, and it's just so sad, and the sense of being heartbroken as a leader, of saying, what happened in my absence? And could I have prevented this? And how do I get you back?
That's a beautiful. I now have to Google these pictures because I don't have them yet in my mind. Um, but of the text, so for this story, what are the elements of this parsha that speak to you know, with what's going on in the world?
Yeah, it's hard because the Parsha starts off differently than it's most famous for, right? It starts off with this description of Bezalel, who's going to be this filled with chachma, filled with wisdom, and he's going to build the vessels, and he's going to build the tabernacle, he's going to build this place for the divine presence. And you just like having that warm, feel good moment, Adam, where you're thinking, wow, such extraordinary, special people with all these gifts. They have expertise, but they also have insight and perception. And you really want them to take a leadership role in building this institution, which will be the spiritual centerpiece of the camp. And then right after that, you just get knocked over. You get knocked over because the people are waiting for Moses and he's not coming down. And people need leaders, and they're happy to have bad leaders. They're happy to have leaders they create and control. And nothing could be so like more than an inanimate leader, right? It's like, oh, imagine your own leadership role, Adam. You go away, you don't come back for a certain period of time, and I put up like a stuffed animal. I'm just like, this is good enough, right? So there's something that's very challenging about the proposition. And then there's this very odd expression, am kshe orefu, and we use it a lot to talk about Israel as the stiff-necked people, right? They're sort of resistant. So it happens that I've recently had spinal surgery. So I have been a stiff-necked person for since August, with some repair work in December. But this feeling of carrying physical pain on my neck, which you feel all the time. It's like it's like a yoke that you wear of discomfort. And I thought a lot about that image differently once I had the physical pain. What does it mean to be a people who carry some discomfort and burden all the time? And I think we feel that now.
First of all, refuah shlema, you should have a
Thank you.
full recovery.
Thank
Uh,
you.
what there are a couple of images that come into my mind, and one of them is when you're in a place like that, especially something with your neck and having that pain, the amount of minute movements that happen an infinite number of times in a day that you have no
Yeah.
idea when you're healthy. And then when you're not healthy, you feel them.
Right. You feel it. And it feels quite chronic. I mean, it does get better slowly. But it's not really, in terms of me and my health, it's really the metaphor for what is it, where do you carry stress in your body? It's
Yeah.
always an interesting question. And what happens when you're a people collectively who carries a burden and you always have to manage that burden? Right now, there's a Jewish identity equation. It's very uncomfortable for a lot of Jews. Some Jews are very comfortable being out there as a Jew. And for others, it wasn't such an overt part of their self description. And now, people who don't necessarily want to be called Jewish or thought of that way are actually they have no choice, right? That is the way that they're going to be called and thought of, and they're going to struggle with that identity.
So in the comparison here, in the absence of good leadership, or frankly any leadership, people are going to create their own, even if it's an inanimate object. In your experience right now in this Jewish moment, rise of anti-Semitism, post October 7th, I mean, there are a number of touch points that we can point to. So I don't want to be limited just to the bad things. Is this something you're seeing right now, that these Jews that have they created their own inanimate leader? Are they missing
Um,
leadership?
I mean, I think this is a really interesting political moment to talk about leadership and and the sort of strong man leader image that we have across the world, right? And we have to be able to have this conversation with the safety of nonpartisanship, right? Which is, I'm not talking about a party, I'm talking about a persona, a leadership persona, which is not Moses's persona, right? When you see descriptions, particularly in Numbers 12, Moses is described as the most humble person in the world. He did not want this job. And not only did he not want this job, he told God many, many times, I'm not your person. Like, this is not, I'm not the right one. And I think that should be a Jewish response when because if you think seriously about the task of leadership and the consequences of leadership, you think to yourself, this is too big for me. I can't. I don't deserve it, and I don't know if I'm competent enough to do it. And then you have this scene where Moses, who made himself small as a leader in this particular instance, makes himself invisible, right? He's on a mountain. And being on a mountain with God, when you're on, I'm going to call it introverted leadership as opposed to extroverted leadership, being on a mountain is fantastic, right? It's like you're with the commandments, you're with the word of God. And Moses radiates in that. His face is radiating. He needs a veil. But when you're dealing with the tough scramble life of a leader on the ground, you're not on the balcony, you are on the dance floor of leadership. And it's a battle all the time. And now you come back and you've had this experience. It's not even like you can talk to anyone about the spiritual high that you're on, because you come down and people are engaged in the exact opposite of what you've experienced. It's not, no one's turning and saying, Moses, how was it up on that mountain? I can't believe you brought us this amazing gift. Moses drops these tablets or throws them, depending on your understanding of what happens. He doesn't ask God. He doesn't say, God, is it okay? This thing that you gave me, which is the holiest thing, and a physical animate sign of revelation. I didn't ask. I've been asking you about everything, but I'm not actually asking you if I can drop these. Um, I think that's amazing. I think it's almost irreverent. It's hard to understand. And there's this beautiful midrashic treatment that the tablets were very, very heavy, but when Moses was carrying them, they were light. When you're carrying something and it feels light, but then when he saw all the people dancing around an idol, they became their actual weight, and that's why he dropped them.
Wow.
You can carry the world when you're mission driven. Look, how it is. You work on behalf of our people, you work on behalf of humanity. You carry a lot, but you think that's in service, I can carry. But then, when something hits you and it punctures your humanity, it's like, this is just way too heavy for me.
So how do we come back from that? How do we get from a what's a leadership lesson in somebody who is in service now all of a sudden feels the weight of this, can't do it. But he goes back up, he
He
tries it
goes,
again.
yeah, he tries it again, but of course the intervening experience is the negotiating of forgiveness.
Hmm.
And I think that we get so engaged in, the cow idolatrous image, right? This golden calf, that sometimes we miss that moment of forgiveness, which is actually a central text in the prayers of Yom Kippur, right? We keep going back and reading it again and again. And this is how I understand it broadly. And I'm just interested in your thoughts on this. When you look at the book of Exodus as a whole, you got the first 15 chapters of slavery and liberation. It's the Exodus story. Then you have the pre-Sinai story, Sinai and post-Sinai. And then you have the Mishkan, right? Then you have the chapters about the tabernacle, its instructions, its construction. And then right there you have, in the midst of that, you have this scene of breakage and repair. And I think the experience of God through Sinai was so overwhelming. There was no room for human beings. And in fact, when God says the Ten Commandments, the people say, can Moses say it? And this is just too much. Godliness, to live a fully godly life, it's the extinction of human instinct. It's extinction of being human, because when you start thinking about God, it's overwhelming. And I think the golden calf was the people's response to all God all the time. Now we're going to be all human all the time. And that's how we're going to sort of fight God. And when Moses goes up and he describes God and asks for forgiveness, and he says, like, you are God who forgives. It's the first instance we have of sort of meeting halfway down the mountain, really literally, and saying, can you come down a little and I'll come up a little? And we're going to find a place where we can live together. And that ultimately will be the Mishkan. It's not going to be so much, of course, it'll be about the building and the instructions. But until we figure out the real house, right? Where do we stand in relation to each other? I can't live anywhere and you can't live anywhere here. So I see the book of Exodus in that sort of large scape.
I love this. And for me, part of it's because I'm a relatively new dad. And so a lot of what I see in this
Oh, that's nice. That's a honeymoon.
it's a very parental framework with which I'm seeing a lot of things. And
Yeah.
so this year, going through and reading, I see so much in the Torah, and I think like in a beautiful way, not in a way that says that what I'm about to say in terms of not saying that God is or isn't omnipotent or omniscient in the way that truly God understands all these things, but I do believe, and I'm understanding that we are in this together, that God and the people are very much in it together. And Hashem tries in all sorts of ways. First, it's in Gan Eden, and then it's in various ways throughout. Um, but we are constantly learning how to be with one another. And I think that everything is an attempt at giving people a direction to return to this Edenic
Yeah.
experience where we are in harmony with God, that we are truly living in this relational space where we are with God in such an intimate way. And so mitzvot and the ways in which the Jewish people need to relate very much are all in service of and going back to that kind of a place. And to see
But
in
here's the thing, Adam, we can't go back. In other words, there's an angel there and there's a double-edged sword there, right?
a
And
fiery one that's spinning all over.
right, fiery one. It's amazing. And once you leave, you're out. And then the question is, can you negotiate a deep life with God and be angry at God or disappointed in God? Or, I would say the relationship that you have with God, just like the relationship you have with yourself and with others, it's dynamic, it's not static, right? And I think you see that very much in this week's Parsha of how does Moses have to negotiate his new relationship, and how do the people, you get married and you have a most amazing wedding and everything is going beautifully and you go on this honeymoon and it's the most amazing place that you're visiting, and then you get in your first argument
Yeah.
and it's like, wait a minute, I thought this was the romance of the century. And then you realize, oh, this is the work of love. The work of love is not when everything is picture perfect. It's when things are starting to fall apart and you're making decisions about how to love and how to love when it's hard.
I
And
love
that's what I see in Parsha.
And that dynamic, to use your word, dynamic, that just because you hit a road bump doesn't mean it's over. And going through all of those pieces, that's um, the multitude of. And by the way, I just, as I'm sort of thinking it through, I find that when a repair happens after one of those ruptures in a relationship, the relationship is stronger.
Yeah, it is stronger, but it can take time to get past the rupture. And I think I heard this in the name of Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein, and it was very meaningful for me. You know, you have all the instructions to build the temple, and then you have the execution of the temple, of the Mishkan, of this tabernacle. But in between, you have, in the midst of this, you have this rupture. And he describes it as actually as a couple, and they're a couple of wealth, and before they get married, they decide that they're going to build this magnificent house, and they care about every single detail, every board, every wallpaper, every nail, every, and then there's a breach at the honeymoon. You know, he goes off with another woman,
Mm.
and or she doesn't make a difference in this story, because it's a fiction, but the idea of a covenant being broken, like the covenant of marriage, the covenant that God made with us at Sinai, is violently negated. And they go back to the house. They haven't seen the house that they were building. They go back to the house, and although they've made up with each other, when they go back to that house, all those things that they cared so much about don't matter anymore.
Wow.
But Rav Lichtenstein says, but when you're God, all those details do matter again. And it was the idea, you could have built a house that was a little bit less perfect than the description of the house when we started the description, right? It was, but instead, you have every detail retold in the same way. That repetition is a reinforcement. We need to have the same relationship, the same intensity, the same love, the same force after the fact, after the breakdown. And that's a real challenge. And that's where maybe God and humans aren't. You know, humans say that we say we're forgiving, we say we're forgetting, but I don't know if we forgive and forget so easily, but we hope that God does.
In a um, maybe to tie things up in a bow, I don't know if there's a final thought or a connector for you from um, for this week's Parsha, something that's going on in your life, just things that you're seeing at this moment of time and in leadership, or the absence of leadership, I should say. Um, just a final concluding thought for the Shabbos.
Yeah, I think a lot about mountain imagery when I think about Moses. You know, whether it's the mountain Har Chorev, where there was his first divine revelation at the burning bush, or Har Sinai, or here where he's going up and down a mountain and bring messaging. You know, mountain climbing is hard. You know, it's not like, I don't think we actually think about the journey up and then the journey down. And I think Moses does that along a lot of times. And in his concluding story, he goes up Mount Nebo, and then he dies and he's buried in a valley. Um, and I think a little bit about David Brooks's image of the second mountain, that in life, there's the first mountain of achievement that we all climb because we're societally conditioned to, you know, we'll do well in school, and we'll get into, you know, good college, we'll get into good graduate school, we'll get good jobs, and we'll get married maybe and have a few kids and a house, and then sometimes there's very often a disruptor in that picture, and you get sort of knocked down, and then you have to climb the second mountain, and it's a lot harder because it's the mountain that you're sort of creating. It's not the mountain that's created for you. And so I think when I think about the Parsha, I think a lot about the mountain of a good relationship, how hard it is to climb, how easy it is to fall, have something that literally breaks. And then you say, okay, we've got to pick it up and we've got to climb another mountain. It's strenuous. It's strenuous, arduous work, but it's the most meaningful and holy work in the whole world.
Dr. Erica Brown, thank you for your wisdom.
Well, thank you for yours.